the Boot House. Hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. We sure did. A group of us, we went out to Oregon last week. So I was on a plane last week, and we ended up out there. So it's a great holiday.
What's good about Oregon?
What's good about it?
Yeah.
Well, my oldest daughter hosted Thanksgiving, and she and Richard, her significant other, are just wonderfully warm people, open up their home to us. They live in the Rogue Valley, which is a beautiful valley in itself. In Oregon, southern Oregon, the Siskiyou range of the coastal range of Oregon, where you see the pictures, and the Cascades, where all the volcanoes are. Those two mountain ranges come together right near their home, and so they actually live on one side of the valley looking across to the Cascades, and that's the Rogue Valley, where the Rogue River flows there. So it's just a naturally beautiful spot.
What did you do to your kids to make them such mountain lovers?
Yeah, I took them on adventures. Yeah, they are. So, but anyway, we're looking at John's Gospel. We're in week 36. And then from last time, I know I've kind of been testing around this. I know that when I don't bold the text, it's hard to read. But if you are interested in getting more information, I got a lot of this written out. You can go to the Christ in the Rockies website, and these will be posted tomorrow. All of our teachings are posted there. So
is that website or Facebook?
No, it's website. Just christinrockies.org, and you just scroll down and you'll see this posted tomorrow. The slides and the
no hyphens, just Christ in the Rockies.
Christ in the if you just Google Christ in the Rockies, will come up.
Okay.
So from last time we learned John's readers were familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. And John the Baptizer's ministry. As a people, his readers were living under what I'm coining is a chronic pain identity. I'll explain that, review that here in a minute. Now they were close to 1,000 years of existing with the reality of unrealized promise. Their identity is found in Abraham, and God had promised Abraham a land, a people, a blessing, and so forth, and there was a growth and a pinnacle of success known during the Davidic reign, and then everything was lost. And now they were living under this reality of, what now? I'll get to that here in a minute. So that's why I'm saying whether they were conscious of it or not, it is my belief that they were living under this, what's happening? Where are we? And their frame of reference under the Torah teaching would have been summed up in Deuteronomy 30. Deuteronomy 30 represents a much larger framework of perspective. And in Deuteronomy 30, life is summed up as living in relationship with God, in the land, critical, in community as a people, in the now. Life is now. In their frame of mind, life is now. Or death, it's either one or the other. Choose life, Deuteronomy says. Death as being out of harmony with God, characterized by being scattered, not a cohesive people, separated from the land in the now. It's critical. They have a whole idea of life and death is now. It's a state being in the now. And so that is, in my mind, their frame, the audience's frame of reference. The time in which John delivers his gospel, which would have been 94, 5, by the time of his circulation, right about 100, AD. The time was confusing enough in itself, just for the reasons we've already talked about, just touched on. But it was complicated even more so because the community at that time was trying to figure out, what do we do with this Jesus of Nazareth? There had been many voices. And what do we do with this voice? Well, either consciously or subconsciously, the readers of John's Gospel were moaning I'm putting this in my words, Lord, how long? How long do we wait? Or what now? What do we do with this? Now, some people were more aware of that than not. Just like this should sound pretty similar of our context today. What now, Lord? How long, Lord? Are these our moanings of our heart? John's role is a pastor. He's attempting to impart hope into this confusing, dark, jungle-like existence. So that's the whole framework for John's Gospel. This chapter sums up, Deuteronomy 30, we're going just a little bit deeper in Deuteronomy 30, sums up and represents the general framework by which John's audience perceived reality. And that is choice. Choice being either love God, obey God, or disobedience and idolatry. And so for this idea of life in Deuteronomy, life has aspects of, there's a current state, and that state is blessing. Life is correlated to what the Deuteronomist calls blessing, and that blessing is characterized by living in the land and the time in the now. That this is all contingent upon loving the Lord your God and obedience to Him. This is what the Deuteronomist wrote, putting out this choice. Conversely, disobedience and idolatry leads to this state called curse. And so you have blessing and cursing in Deuteronomy 30. And curse is characterized by being scattered in the land. And now, you project that now centuries forward, and the 10 tribes do not exist anymore. They're scattered. They're gone. The only tribe identity is through Judah and Benjamin. The realm is scattered. So in their frame of mind, we're still scattered. Therefore, we must be cursed. The time and the now. Now, they wouldn't say that, just like we don't say it, but they are not at their best game here in the New Testament. That's the point.
Mike, the in the now concept.
Yeah.
Is this like they're viewing life as not a test run for what you're going to be in eternity?
See, this is where what we project onto it because of how we've been brought up. Their frame, they're not thinking. This is not what the Deuteronomist is talking about. He's talking about if we read and study Deuteronomy 30 and just the whole framework of the of the Torah, it's about life now. It's all in the context of now. You don't see teaching about trusting in God and going to heaven. It's silent. They don't have this frame that we have projected onto the text, and so that's what when Deuteronomy 30 is talking about life, it's talking about now. When it's talking about death, it's talking about now. Choose life, he says in Deuteronomy 30. That means loving and obeying. Disobeying brings death, cursing. And curse is tied to death. So is that helpful? I mean, it's difficult for us to see that, but that's really is in my mind really important for us to understand what Jesus is or what John is stating here. So this state of being cursed, and what that state is characterized by is scatteredness, and the time is in the now. And so you have life and death, very polarized in Deuteronomy 30, and it is my opinion that is basic framework of the Jewish thought at that time. Yes.
Who's his audience?
His audience are a mixed group of people who are trying to figure out who this Jesus is.
The Christian.
Well, yeah, but their Christianity is not well defined.
It's Jewish is mixed up. But
You got people who are followers of Christ, of Jesus, going to the synagogue because that's all they have.
right, but Jesus is in the picture.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. And John, marvelously, in his first section of this gospel, is trying to clarify who Jesus is. So that we're going to go there. Yeah. Another question.
Well, not exactly a question, but just that one statement you put up there, I'm reading the book right now, and he talks about the importance of living in the now rather than living somewhere else, living off in the future for our own sanity. It's pretty important for us to live in the now and then respond to the now rather than, well, everything's going to be fine because in someday in the future I'm going to be in heaven.
Right.
And so it's really good to get a handle on where you are right now, living right now, and doing what you need to be doing.
I think that idea. Are you enjoying the book?
So far, yeah, it's
Yeah.
really, and with the response, for instance, if you are living in the now and something upsets you, which way do you go? Do you go into sorrow, or do you go into just the opposite of sorrow and depression? Is going into hope,
Right.
and there is a future.
Yeah.
And it's very important as you live in the now, and as that affects you, which way you go. Are you going to have a pity party, or are you going to say, Lord, what more is there for me? I don't like my situation. Being honest and living in the now.
Yeah. Carl, I just really applaud your efforts and where you're going with that, because I think we as a people, as a culture, could really learn a lot from this type of thing.
Yeah, I have a good friend that's been helping me here a little bit lately.
Yeah.
My wife and I, and my daughter and son-in-law to be are looking at moving completely out of the area. It's been a real upset for us.
Oh.
And he said, no, Carl, God has the whole thing in control. Don't panic. How are you responding? Are you going to respond in sorrow and grief and oh, poor me? Or are you going to go towards God, what God has for you?
And that in itself is a move of faith.
Yeah, that's what we live in.
So there was another comment or two.
Yeah, just a question. The temple's still standing, correct?
Not when John wrote this.
So Rome's basically trashed Jerusalem, torn out the temple and everything.
Which even added more confusion.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They're trying to figure it out, just like we are.
Yeah.
So life and death is there. Now, could somebody read the text 31 through 36?
He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth belongs to the earth and speaks in an earthly way. He who comes from heaven is above all. He bears witness to what he has seen and heard, yet no one receives his testimony. Whoever receives his testimony sets his seal to this, that God is true. For he whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him.
Good. All right. So what we're going to do is work through verse by verse and kind of try to make correlations here, because guys, at first reading, we're used to reading the Bible, and we've kind of just become not used to how it's worded and so forth. But in reality, no one talks like this. There is a large separation here, and again, we want to try to make correlation of what John is writing here as a pastor to his audience in the first century. So remember, the context is John the Baptist just finished his phrase, "He must increase, I must decrease." Speaking of the last words of John the Baptizer. So then I think then John the writer picks up the pencil in verse 31, and he says, "He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is from the earth and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all." Notice, above all is above all. Above all is a key idea here. And what I think John is now tying to, he's tying what has just occurred by putting his testimony of John the Baptist, and now contrasting that with now the role of Jesus, who has become the Christ. So to clarify, John the Baptist was a very influential person. I mean, again, this is my opinion, but word was out on John. Remember, there was confusion. Some thought he was the Messiah. So the one from above, John, I think, is speaking of the Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, who has become the Christ. And then he who is of the earth, I think he's correlating to John, who he's just tying verse 30 and previous to now 31 to show contrast. He who comes from heaven is above all, the Christ. So he's saying here that, now I have some text. John brings this first section, and again, I'm interpreting this end of chapter 3 as his first move. Think of it as a movement in the gospel. We're going to pick up in 4:1 with the narrative. So there's a change, like a scene change. And so I think this is a conclusion here. John brings this first section of his gospel account to conclusion by first using 3 parallel statements to extrapolate on John the Baptizer's parting words. In the first 3 chapters, 1 through 3, John incrementally clarifies who Jesus is. From the very beginning, in 1 through 4, he opens up and he says, John, in the very beginning, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now we got to again understand, they had no clear thinking on the Trinity. They weren't Trinitarian. But John, under the influence of God's Spirit, is writing that no, there was a second power in heaven who is a voice and who is the creative agency and sustainer of all things. And then he develops his gospel. He develops the idea of Jesus, who he is. Later, in verse 14, the Word becomes flesh. And then that Word becoming flesh is designated as an eternal Son who is the only begotten. And finally, here in chapter 3, it develops with John's testimony punctuating these ideas, pointing to the Christ. Finally, here, the Son becomes the Christ. In John 3:27 through 30, John the Baptizer says, "I told you, I am not the Christ, but I am the forerunner of the Christ." And I think that's a punctuation, is that the Christ, and we're going to talk about what that means. So you see the progression, or at least from my perspective, there's a progression. He's clarifying, in my mind, who Jesus is. John the writer now punctuates this progression of thought through the use of the term above all. He is the one that is above all. John's writing thus far, reinforced by John the Baptizer's witness, is pointing to Jesus, the Christ, as the one who is above all. Listen up, folks. So, the one above all. So now, in verse 32, I think the flow then continues. The flow of thought is he's talking about now the above all one. The above all one, what he has seen, the above all one, and heard of that he testifies. Okay, that's an easy idea to grasp. But yet then he says, and no one receives his testimony. Where are you going with that, you know? But then in 33 he says, who has received his testimony has set his seal to this, that God is true. Boy, what is he talking about here? Well, I think that this is no different than the language used in chapter 1, verse 5, and then in 10 through 13. Listen to this. Speaking of the pre-incarnate Word in 1:5. The light, the 1 through 4 sets the Word up as the light and the life and the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness, I got King James, overcame it not, or would not, in my mind, it means would not receive it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness wouldn't receive it. Then later, in 10 through 13, he was now, this is also the pre-incarnate Word, the Word present from the very beginning. He was in the world, and the world was made by him. And the world knew him not. The entire world was made by him, and the world did not know him. He came into his own, now a more localized scope, bringing it down to his very own. The light came, and to his own, and they received him not. But, in verse 13, contrast, but to as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who call on his name. So there's this all-inclusive, no one receives, verse 32, but then he intentionally contradicts that idea with he who has received. This isn't a mistake. This is to draw attention. This is he's using literary technique here to draw us to he who has received in verse 33. And then this correlates to what I just read in regard to the pre-incarnate Word. And I think this is similar to how we would express, no one thinks like that, or no one does that, where we speak in a generality, making a statement to punctuate a point that, generally speaking, no one thinks like that, honey. You know. Yeah, right. So we use this same literary kind of communication. We don't literally mean that no one thinks like that, but generally speaking, the light coming into the darkness was not received. But yet, throughout all of history, there were some who have received. See, you get the idea? Okay. Then, now this phrase here that's an enigmatic phrase of he sets his seal to this. When you think of a seal, bam, remember how they sealed the old letters, seal, that God is true. In the setting of the seal, in my mind, is a graphic representation of how we would say, I'm in. But to as many as received him, in 1:10 through 3, became the children of God. Here, it's a parallel statement. He who received his testimony has set his seal to this, that God is true. Guys, we're taking a lot of time on this because this is a very, very difficult spot in John. So we're kind of moving through it. I've spent hours thinking about this. So, this is not, and, I'm consulting other sources, lots of other sources to get here. So this represents what I'm landing. So we're intentionally going slow just because we really are attempting to understand it in light of what John is writing. So So that's verse 32 and 33. And again, I think the flow continues. John is now still talking about the above all one. He whom God has sent, the above one is the one who God has sent, speaks the words of God. For he, we'll talk about that in a minute, gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hands. So how can we correlate this within what John is saying? And, John continues towards his conclusion by assuring his audience that Jesus the Christ, who is the above all one, is unrestricted and full of authority. So as the flow continues, John's thought is he's talking about this above all one, where all is focused on. John the Baptizer has punctuated this, that all focus should be on this above all one, the Christ. And the Christ is unrestricted and in full authority. The Father has given all authority into this Son that he's talking about. And sourced, and this is sourced within the eternal, divine love relationship within the Godhead that John opens up his gospel with. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. There was a relationship in heaven from the very beginning of all time. And this was a new idea. They didn't, guys, Israel is all about the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord our God is one. And that's the prayer of the Jewish, practicing Jews, I think twice a day, is they recite that. So this is new to them. So full, unrestricted, full authority, and flowing out of a divine love relationship within the Godhead. The idea of Trinity will be defined in about the 4th century. But yet, everything, the New Testament writers were very conversant with the idea of Spirit, Son, Father, Son, and Spirit. But it wasn't well defined and became a Christian doctrine until much, much later. So John is talking about a relationship that existed in heaven, and there is one prior to all things. And there was one, that one is the one who is the creator and the sustainer of all things. And that one came and entered into the world through a person, Jesus of Nazareth. And God gave this entity a face. And we call that face Jesus. And he is the beloved Son of all time, this divine relationship. And that divine Son has become the Christ, punctuated by John the Baptist. And so that's where we are in the gospel at this point. We're going to wait to go to verse 36, that really interesting verse, and we'll look at that next week. So there you go. Some food for thought.
Mike, I think, I'm not mistaken, I believe that the Greek word they use for true